Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Ill Soy Advisor. Today, Kelsey Litchfield, I'm joined by Stephanie Porter with Illinois Soybean Association and Dr. Connor Sible, who we've had on the podcast before, who had a lot of great things to share. And Stephanie thought it'd be a good idea. I thought so, too, when she said it. I don't want to give Stephanie all the credit. But I said, let's have Connor come back on and talk about some of these things we're seeing this planting season and reassure growers that everything will be okay. But Connor, real quick, I just want you to give us an update of how your trial site's going. What are you experiencing out on those sites right now?
Yep. So most of our trials here are East Central Champaign County, Champaign-Urbana on campus. And what we're seeing, everyone I think across the state got that mid-April window, and a lot of planters were rolling. And then it's been raining, right? And hit or miss spots. I think we kind of were talking about that. Planters are able to go here or there, but it's not that full force window that we maybe saw in mid-April. I promised that we didn't do this, to get on the good side of the Soybean Association. So we put our soybeans in that first April window, April 16th, 17th, and then a little bit 22nd, 23rd, I think we got back in. So we did most of our Champaign soybean. We prioritized that first. Couple reasons why we like that earlier soybean, higher yield potential. We knew the forecast looked a little, cool and wet. And soybean, I got to give credit to our breeders these days. The seed treatments, they can handle that a lot better than corn. Corn's just still a big baby and needs to be, coddled and have all the perfect conditions. So that's why we went with the soybean first. And then now we're looking at the calendar and we're May 9th, right? I have 3 corn trials in and about 50 to go. And research planners move a little slower. And so I know, I've done the math about how many good days of planting I have left. But one of the things that I'm not overly concerned yet about late planting, the questions I start receiving, and Stephanie had this one too, right? When do you start switching from corn to beans? Or if you're still running corn, when do you start reducing that maturity? If you're running a full season hybrid, what date do you maybe say, do I drop at 5 maturity your RMs there or something? General rule of thumb I hear is sometimes May 15th, right? Full maturity hybrids through May 15th. And then if you have the option to still bring that down through the second half of May. Personally, I'm, a little bit of a gambler. I'm comfortable putting corn in full season hybrids through May. Obviously, north part of the state, that potential early frost is a bigger concern. Southern Illinois, I know you start to fight if you're going to put something in for a double crop or follow your corn with some wheat. So understanding those implications. But as far as yield goes, I'm still comfortable with corn through May. So that's kind of
okay. So I have my little voice of my brother in my head, and all the other farmers. I get texts and snaps and everything else. So last year, we just think about last year, right? Because that's what comes to mind first. The corn was a little slower to dry. I heard that with our 115 day, and so that's in their minds already. Plus with the fungicide, like if they put fungicide on last year. So just some other maybe management considerations too. And we don't know what Mother Nature is going to throw to us. Where I'm at, we normally don't ever talk about a, dry, like a slower harvest, so just things to keep in mind too. And we have planted everything but the 115 days. So that's where we're at right now. So what's your recommendation there, I guess?
Yep. So we have a trial this year that's going to look at 2-pass fungicide, VTR1 followed by an R3. And I have already been thinking about my northern site, right? What's that R3 2-pass fungicide going to look like come October, and it's time to harvest if it's still green. So big thing on management, definitely, and the end of the season. And I know some people are thinking, well, we're not even done planting. Why are we talking harvest yet? But it's good things to consider. Put a plan in place. We don't know what the weather's going to do. I'm glass half full kind of guy. And so I look at the positives, right? Our subsoil moistures are replenished. So that's a huge benefit to get us through the season. Make sure we can get that crop off and running to a good start. Management practices that can delay that dry down. Fungicide, I think, is the big one we think about. Anyone that's really progressive, full system, in-season side dressing, other starter on the planter, I mean, if you build a big healthy green factory pushing for those 250, 275, 300 plus bushels, you are going to have greener longer into the season, and that might slow the harvest down, or you might have to wait for harvest. So definitely things to consider as we get later planting, and how you manage that will impact the dry down specifics. I don't think it'll influence the actual black layer timing, right? But it's how green that tissue is, and then getting it to a point that you can kind of combine through. Other management factors to consider on the pest management side, herbicides. As you think about, when I think about layer planted, this season, I'm not as concerned about the final yields unless we really start to get into that June window. But thinking next year, and just be conscious if your corn is going in the second half of May, when that post-emergence herbicide goes out, what are you putting in that pass? And making sure that we're not going to get into those plant back-ish windows if, say, 2025 is an early planting season. So just some things to consider. But once that crop's in the ground, that's the first step, of course, and then thinking what we might decide on management. And then back to the fungicide too. If we turn dry again and we don't have the disease pressure on the corn side, then maybe we don't need that fungicide because of the disease pressure. The last 2 years, we've done fungicide trials. We've averaged around 5 to 9 bushel response to fungicide, depending on which location we're at. And that's 2 years of drought and didn't have the disease pressure. I've seen fungicide give me 30 bushels in a heavy disease scenario. So yes, things to consider as the season goes on, what practices may or may not be needed, and how those might influence final maturity.
So, and I'm just going to say it, commodity prices too. And we've already invited you, giving you a plug to one of our field days, which that'll be a topic, but just wanted to throw that wrench in too. That's going to be a big factor going forward. If we start planting this corn late, commodity prices remain low, what are we going to do? I mean, that could be a whole nother podcast, right, Kelsey? She's like, okay, here we go again.
Yep. And these are great things to be thinking of. Part of me does think, well, we do have to know at least when it does go in the ground and come up. Then we can start making hard decisions, but being conscious of what questions we will need to ask. And yes, we have to think the economics, especially like I said, if you have good practices in place with good, seeding singulation, good depth, you get that crop off to a good start just by the conditions you put it into. That'll go a long way, and then maybe you don't need to add anything on top of it to still get an economic benefit to it, right? I always think with the National Corn Growers, the big yield contest, I say you need a profitability category, right? Not just bushels per acre, but dollars per acre, because you can be quite profitable on 200 bushel corn. It doesn't have to be 300 to make all of that profitability, depending on how much you're putting into it.
Okay, so let's get back on task. So one of the main reasons I wanted to have Connor on here is because we need to start thinking corn. So it's going to be almost mid-May. We put so much emphasis on planting your beans first. It's like, okay, let's stop everything. We've got to regroup here, right? So now we're getting almost into mid-May, and I'm going to say, let's plant all your corn first now. Or let's get the corn in the ground, and then let's put the beans to the side, right? And so it's just because beans are a little tougher. They can take more stress. We plant, like in my head, I'm further south. I'm not in southern, I'm not in the deep south of Illinois, but we plant double crop, right? And there's some people that do, I'm not going to say they don't try to do a second crop of corn. That's been tried before too. But in general, beans can take a little bit more stress. So now we're saying, and you just said corn needs coddled, right? So let's switch to the corn now. So I guess that's one of the main things I wanted to get across is that we're going to have to start thinking corn now. And going forward with that.
Focus, I think, on getting the corn in this May window, the next planting windows we've got. Because soybean, as durable as it is, right, we know that you can get really nice yields if you're on the earlier end. Or it gives you the opportunity to put them in without risk of hitting the yield on the corn side. But yes, definitely that time of window when you start balancing the economics to it, we want the corn to go in May if we can. And then beans can yield quite well if they're planted last week of May, first 2 weeks of June. As you mentioned, double crop. I mean, there's opportunity there. And so focusing on the corn, yes, that would be I would agree with you on that. It is time to that. The one thing I would say is don't mud it in either. I mean, have a little bit of patience, right? I mean, I get it. I forecast they just threw rain in for us Monday, Tuesday, and I'm like, where'd that come from? But if we could go roll tomorrow, I think I would push it to Saturday, right? Give it that extra day. It can make a big difference. And so yes, a lot of conditions and things to consider. I mean, I know I have 10 days left. I did the math. I need 10 solid days of planting to get the rest of my projects in. So I'm in the same boat, what do we do? So in general, I had a quick summary because I'm rambling. Now that we are getting into May 10th and on, it's time to focus on corn. Don't give up on it. I think corn through May is just fine. Keep your plans in place. And then when it comes up, we'll make the in-season decisions as those come. I'm comfortable with full season maturing into May 25th for me for that central to southern Illinois. If you do get into northern Illinois, May 15th or so, some may consider dropping the RM on some of their corn, but I wouldn't quite switch from corn to beans until we get into that June window.
So, Connor, the ones that have planted corn, I'm hearing reports of uneven corn emergence now, the ones that have put the seed out there. Any feedback for that? Any advice on that? I know they're at the point now where it's out scouting and season management. So what do you have to say for those that did get the corn in, but they're seeing maybe some problems with emergence?
Yep. So obviously we have to start, look at stand counts. What is that? If there's loss of stand or just the uneven emergence. So there's two different things to be sure we distinguish between loss of stand, that's loss of ears, and then we have to start looking at the replant scenarios on those. As far as uneven emergence, if you have the stand, right, there's a balance there, how uneven. I mean, if you're 2 growth stages apart, that, can have a huge impact. But if they're still within a growth stage, then it's making sure we manage that crop. I don't think that would warrant any replant scenario. Big thing to consider, we've been really, really wet and a lot of nitrogen was out last fall and or early spring. And this will be a good season in my mind for response to side dress nitrogen. That is definitely one of those inputs I think that will pay for itself. Thinking split applied nitrogen, or if you did all pre-plant, just keep an eye on that crop as you scout. Is it starting to yellow a little earlier than we'd like? Be ready to maybe put a few units on side dress if these are the conditions that are setting us up for that nitrogen loss in the spring.
I'm glad you brought that up. That is something we can talk about. I know I've been reading a lot of articles where some agronomists and are recommending, depending on if you put on fall anhydrous or maybe some early season urea or UAN type of activities. And then now what after all this rain? And first thing that pops in my mind, I'm like, oh my gosh, we haven't even planted. Like, oh my gosh, why are we talking about this? I'm so stressed out. And the second time, I was like, oh my gosh. So then I put out an email to Giovanni, which I think he's going to respond to. But yeah, I think it's just something we have to think about because I told Kelsey we're going to have early planted corn in some spots and we're going to have some really late planted corn and it's going to be all over the place and scouting's not going to be the funnest. But yeah, do you have any comments? I don't know if you have any, and if it's okay if you don't, on your opinion on if you think that we might need some more nitrogen, maybe some side dressing needs to go on, or other applications if they already put all their N on.
Yep, and definitely I think there is going to be spots that warrant additional N. I mean, if you put out a 180 units up front pre-plant, but it went out before April 15th, then you might be looking to need another 30, 40 unit side dress in those areas. Nobody knows their fields better than the farmers themselves, right? So those spots that are more prone to that water movement. Hilltop's probably fine, right? The variable rate application is, I think, a phenomenal tool. And so it doesn't have to be every acre on that field needs that a little bit supplemental, but if you know which spots are more prone to loss, probably going to be looking and considering 34 units, 40 units. Side dress, I think might be a good help. And then to balance back and forth, we had a really mild winter, 2022 and 2023 being dry. I think a lot of the nitrogen that went out in both of those years was still in the system. We did not have a great response to nitrogen last year, and I think that was twofold: the drought, but also how much of 2022's end was still hanging around. We had a really mild winter. We really didn't hard freeze for a long extended period of time. And then we've had the subsoils replenished. And so I'm not banking as much this year on any residual nitrogen from last season like I could in 2023. So as much as, I don't want to say pour on more nitrogen, right? Because we have some water quality conditions that are serious to consider. Use those inhibitors with those pre-plant applications if you haven't done them yet. Be sure we're watching those best management practices to ensure that the N we are supplying does stay in the field best we can. So that's kind of just some feedback on that. But definitely, yes. If you've got all your N out at this point and you have or have not planted, you might consider needing a little bit more in season.
Dang, I think we've covered a lot here in the 20 minutes. I'm like,
no, we went in places I didn't know we were going to go. That's fine.
Yeah. Well,
That's
one
great.
of the things, I guess, if I was to summarize, and then, if Kelsey needs to do her magic and pull some of the rambling out, big things
No,
I
you're
would
good.
say, when farmers are saying, all right, May 9th today, no matter where you are in planting, I know a lot of farms at least have a few more fields left to go. If not the whole farm. I know some folks haven't even started yet. I'm comfortable with corn through May 30th. I think we really don't need to start pulling back the RM until May 25th. Consider that if you're going to stick with corn. And I would stick with corn before transitioning those acres to soybean through May. I really don't think we need to make that decision until we're looking at June planting dates. That's where the corn yields really start to drop off, and then soybean can hold its own and make that profitability come back. So corn in May, I'm good to go. Soybeans, switch that over if we're starting to get into June, if you need to make that call. And then just consider impacts of how we manage in season. As Stephanie said, fungicide or other applications that promote plant health might delay the harvest. And if you're planning to drill something behind, keep in mind those considerations at the back end of the season.
Yeah, and I think it's too early for me to start talking about, I think we're still stay the course, go corn, then beans. If we hit June, or towards the end of May, we might start talking about changing some management decisions as we, get that far. That could be a later podcast, but I am already getting asked those questions. So I'm already trying to prepare, but I'm like, hey, I think this is the focus right now for farmers going forward. And I guess I have another question as well. So, for example, there for Central Illinois, we may have these wet holes, right, for corn, and we may have 112 day, 110 day, I don't know, out there. Do we replant back that maturity that we planted, or do we change maturities on corn as we get later? Let's say we planted corn in, let's say, April 9th or 8th, for example, and we don't get back into the field until, gosh, I hope mid-May, maybe later. Do we switch a maturity as we start to plant in those wet holes?
That's a fantastic question. One I have no personal experience with, or I can't even think of articles off the top of my head. I bet there's some resources there. But in general, I would say maybe, yes, that would be a safe bet, because you don't want these patches in the field to just be way behind the rest of it come harvest. So definitely wet spots that are replanting where you already have corn emerged. If you can get a few units of something on an earlier RM, I think that would benefit when you go back to harvest for timeliness and consistency across the field.
Be cognizant of traits, maybe, too.
Yeah.
But I agree with you, because I don't want to hear the complaining of the spots during harvest. So
Yep. And the other thing that I would say, if you have early corn, right, and some farms are going to have a 40-day spread from the first corn going into the last corn. Use that early corn to your advantage. Make sure that your combine if you can only harvest 20% of it now because the other stuff's going to need another 20, 25 days to finish off. Really, really focus on setting those combines this fall on the early stuff, because then you can guarantee to preserve as much yield on the later stuff. Driving around the combine loss the last few years, I mean, some volunteer corn out there, that's a lot of bushels. And I think we get in a hurry sometimes. Don't set it on the first field and think good to go through the last field. So use that early corn. One, it'll be good yielding and the management to really set the combine so that we minimize harvest loss. So that way, when you get to that late planted corn, you're capturing as much of it you can, minimizing harvest loss. I think that'll make huge gains, and that's just yield preservation at that point. So don't let late corn think you have to get through it faster before, we get into some weather towards the end of the late fall, early winter, if you're getting to that point. So that's my recommendation. Use that early corn to really get that combine as clean as can be.
I only have one more question, unless Stephanie has anything.
Nope. I'm gonna stop. I'm gonna leave him alone.
we could go all day, but like before I ask my final question, before I ask my final question, I'll say again, plug. Connor will be at our tailgate talk in Western Illinois, which is Augusta, July 25th, and I'll quick plug, all registrations open for our field days this summer, so go to illsoyadvisor.com. So my final question for you, Connor, I know there's a lot to think about right now with planting and being in the moment and making sure you're making good management decisions now. However, looking towards summer, is there anything on your radar that isn't on the farmers that just to be thinking about as we progress? I know we've covered a little bit, but is there anything else that you think people aren't talking about, but they should be thinking about?
Ooh, that's a good question there in the end. I mean, like I said, harvest is one of those. As mentioned, some haven't even gotten seed in the ground. Why are we talking harvest?
Yeah.
But in general, equipment across the board. You can get in a hurry and a rush. You already own that piece of equipment. Except you say go back to economics and inputs. The equipment that you have is so useful, and just make sure that we have all that as best prepared as we can, because the seeding, everything with the planter everything about yield starts with that planter. Just going a few extra hours to make sure that every row unit's where it needs to be will make big gains without needing to pay for an additional input. Same with sprayer passes, things like that, checking those nozzles, make sure that every spray application we do is designed to get the efficacy for the coverage, minimize crop damage in those cases. And on the harvest side, you've got that combine, you have to run the combine through the field. So make sure it's set as well as it can. So those I think are easy areas to preserve yield and economics, because equipment, that's a must. Then we can make decisions on in-season inputs such as fertilizer, nitrogen, or the fungicide play. I have seen the cutworm flights early this year. I know those are things to be watching for. We were just out at our first soybean planting date from our April 16th planting date. Bean leaf beetles are already there. I'm at just the unifoliate leaves and not even pushing trifoliates yet, and we've got feeding. So be looking for, as you said, scouting's all over the board. If you do have stuff up and you can't run the planter today, scout and decide if we need to do anything about bean leaf beetle early feeding, and then keep an eye out for those cutworm flights as well.
I guess I just want to put in a reminder that seed treatments only last so long. And I mean, I'm having those discussions where my brother is like, oh my gosh, they already got, maybe I should have planted in February. And so now, our April beans are at the same growth stage as those beans that were planted in February or March. And so whose seed treatment, we have a little bit left, probably not much efficacy left. Theirs has been sitting there. And so here comes all the pests. And you said bean leaf beetles. We've had some reports of those. I'm starting to get pictures of possible seed corn maggots. It hasn't been, for sure. Things like that. Of course, slugs are coming in as well. So be aware of that as we go forward.
Yep, I agree.
I know scouting's always important, but I'm what I'm hearing from this, from other conversations, it's more important than ever to get out there and understand what's going on in your field. So, thanks, Connor. Anything else that you want to say, share that we forgot?
All I would just say is, stick to the plan. It'll be all right. Planting will end eventually. It's another season, another chance to learn and things like that. Understand there's a lot of stress because it's income involved. But I think keeping a calm head and just focused on going one field at a time is going to be the best thing that we can do. Because whether we're on the farm, if you're putting seed in for a company doing seed production, or on the research side, I think the best thing is just one field at a time and try and stick to that plan. At least we're still in May. So that's different conversation maybe
Corn
come
in
May 30th.
May,
But
it's okay.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, once we get to that point, we'll
Reconvene.
reconvene. Yeah. Well, thanks,
Yep.
Connor. Stephanie, thank you for joining us today to talk through these subjects. More agronomic news and information, just go to illsoyadvisor.com.